He was probably drinking heavily at most stages in his adult life.
He liked being around young women.
The Nazi mass rallies are essentially theatrical stagings.
Tolstoy is the archetypal repentant nobleman.
It's basically absorbed into Macbeth.
His father, his uncles, his grandfathers, they all die. No role models.
Welcome to the Canon Club with Paul Morland and Ed West, exploring the Western canon in art, music and literature, one life at a time. This week,
Hitler identified with this fellow Upper Austrian who tried to go to Vienna and as an artist and was rejected by the Viennese status quo. So you have a strange paradox of Brahms, the Viennese symphonist, and poor Bruckner, a symphonist living in Vienna. And it is absolutely true that he heard of the death of Wagner while composing the slow movement of the Seventh Symphony.
Anton Bruckner.
Anton Bruckner was born in 1824 in Ansfelden near Linz in Upper Austria, the eldest of 11 children born to a schoolmaster. He became a teacher, then was appointed an organist, eventually moving to Vienna. Bruckner was a late developer as a composer, lacking confidence in his abilities. After various early efforts, including 2 preparatory symphonies, he wrote 9 fully recognised symphonies, 3 sacred masses, a Te Deum and motets. Although often mocked as a country bumpkin, he came by the end of his life to be recognised as one of the era's great orchestral composers. He died in 1896. Dr. Bryan Gilliam is an emeritus professor of Duke University and an authority on the music of Anton Bruckner, Gustav Mahler and Richard Strauss, among others. Dr. Gilliam, could you give us the background to Bruckner's early life and the context he grew up in?
Anton Bruckner was the son of Upper Austria. He was the son of a school teacher. He himself was a school teacher. And in fact, let's put this in context. He was very much like Schubert, a school teacher, then composer. So an Austrian thoroughly, an Upper Austrian very importantly, in terms of his later relationship with Vienna and his being identified with Upper Austria by a fellow Upper Austrian named Adolf Hitler. The 3 important periods of his life are of course, his youth in Ansfelden, where he was born, and then St. Florian. Then he goes to Linz, and in Linz, he's taking composition lessons from Simon Sechter, who lived in Vienna and was amazed by his abilities and then invited him to come to Vienna. So if we're talking about the 3 major periods of his life, we're talking St. Florian, Linz, then Vienna.
Thank you for that. So tell us a little bit more about his early composition, his life as an organist, and the musical influences on him in the early days.
Anton Bruckner was, first of all, a devout Catholic. His life has to be understood in the context of the church, with which he was devoted his entire life. And as a musician and a church musician, his entire education was through the church, through the monastery of St. Florian. So he had early organ lessons, piano lessons, harmony, theory lessons, but also his early education was from the monks of that monastery. And there he wrote early church pieces. They were modest works. He wrote little pieces for the organ, not many, but he was a choral composer and I guess a modest composer. He was well aware of his shortcomings. And that is why when he moved then from St. Florian to Linz, he began composition lessons. And this is really interesting. In 1855, he began studying with Simon Sechter, one of the great pedagogues of Austria. He studied with him for 6 years and did not compose anything over that 6-year period. He wanted to totally master composition. And at times, Sechter would say, Anton, stop it. I've taught you enough. You know it. No, he said, no, I want to take it all the way to the end and get my certificate, and then I know I'm ready to be a mature composer.
That does suggest a certain lack of self-confidence.
He had a lack of self-confidence. He had a crazy mania about getting certificates and awards. I went to St. Florian. I've been there several times, actually. But the first time I went there, I went to the so-called Bruckner room, where you have his bed and the picture of his mother by the side of his dead mother, a corpse by the side of his bed. All of these ribbons and certificates all over the room, hanging on the walls. It's quite a scene.
He was a strange character, wasn't he? And particularly awkward with women. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, he was very awkward. I don't know that was the country bumpkin aspect. I think he was just socially awkward. I don't know if it was a Virgin Mary complex, being a devout Catholic, but he liked being around young women. There was nothing Me Too-ish about that, but if he was attracted to a member of the opposite sex, they would be younger than he. Whether they were a chambermaid or a young woman in the choir. I'm sorry, Paul, that's what it is.
I read that he once confessed to his housekeeper that he had once kissed a girl and that he was still repenting the sin.
That's true, from what I know. And I don't know, I mean, how do we know these things? But he may have been a virgin all his life, for that matter.
Tell us about his organist role and the influence it had on his composing.
As you know, by the end of his life, he was a world-renowned organist. There was a famous trip he made to London where he played an organ concert in the Crystal Palace. The sad thing about his being an organist was that organists tend to improvise. That is, at least back, especially in the 19th century, that is what an organist was expected to do. So we have very little organ music that he composed. 4 modest pieces, if I recall. In no way does that show the level of his music making. But he started out being an organist. He played the famous organ at St. Florian. He is buried in the crypt beneath the organ. I visited that crypt. I got locked in there by accident one time as a 20-year-old in the dark.
You didn't see his ghost?
I felt the ghost. I was with a touring group. I didn't know you could only go to the crypt with a group. So they were already down there. I went, just snuck in. And then they left and the gate was shut. The lights were off. It was pitch black. And I was there with the final remains of the great Anton Bruckner, feeling the spirit. And that is my claim to fame.
Can you tell us firstly about the main musical influences on him? And secondly, tell us about his journey to Vienna, his settling in Vienna, and his finding himself in the middle of the culture wars, if you like, of the 1870s.
There was a real culture war. And this war had its origin really in social politics of Vienna. We need to look to 1848, that famous year of revolution all over Europe, really, but certainly in Vienna. It was a revolution, but a revolution not for the proletariat, but for the business class. We now see the rise of a business class, a desire for a constitutional monarchy, a rise of a Protestant class. So we have a split between the Protestants and the Catholics. The Catholics were the devout followers of Emperor Franz Joseph, and the business class were the Protestants, who were merchants, salesmen, lawyers, professionals. And Bruckner found himself on the side of the Catholics, on the side of the emperor. So politically and religiously, there he was. But he found himself also involved in a split between those who followed the emperor and the more conservative tastes, and those who followed the bourgeois business musical tastes of Edward Hanslick, who was the music critic for the Neue Freie Presse, the New Free Press, which was the major organ of Viennese bourgeois life. And Hanslick gave Tuesday evening lectures every week, and there he proselytized for Johannes Brahms, the Protestant composer from Germany living in Vienna, and the one applauded by the Vienna audience, for that matter. So you have a strange paradox of Brahms, the Viennese symphonist, and poor Bruckner, a symphonist living in Vienna.
Professor Gilliam, I think it's very much the case with Bruckner and some, but not all composers, that he seems to get better as he goes on. He goes from some pieces which are maybe a bit gauche, a bit awkward, and even that gaucheness and awkwardness, it remains, but it gets something magical comes in so that the music goes beyond it in a way. Do you want to talk us through some of the earlier works and how he got started, really, and the sort of reception they got?
He started out composing religious pieces for choir, for chorus. The early ones were modest, but after his period with Hanslick, that period between 55 and 61, he composes these marvelous masses. There are 3 masses and a requiem, motets, the famous Ave Maria, the Psalm 150 motet. And these are actually quite good. These are wonderful pieces, and they were always loved by the general public. It is then he starts composing symphonies. When he goes to Vienna, we see a progression. The early symphonies are modest pieces, and we see him on a very steep learning curve as these symphonies get better and better. The first landmark being the third, then the really one that really put him in the driver's seat, so to speak, the fourth, the so-called Romantic Symphony. That's the first one that really gave him international status. And then, of course, the famous Seventh Symphony, which begins the final, dare we call it the final trio of Bruckner works, the 3 great ones. And a symphony of Bruckner requires almost a stretching of the psychological time. You have to meditate practically when you're listening to a Bruckner symphony. And American audiences simply do not have the patience for it. It's a shame because if you are in Austria or in Germany and you're taking a music history course, you'll probably have a lecture on the late 19th century symphony, Austro-German symphony, and you will have a lesson on Brahms and Bruckner. Now, I'm one of the few music historians who I teach Bruckner. I always taught Bruckner in my classes about the late 19th century Austro-German symphony. Because to understand the late 19th century Austro-German symphony is to embrace Bruckner. I mean, there's simply, say what you will about your personal taste, you cannot deny the greatness, the legacy, the importance of Bruckner in the history of the symphony.
We're in his 200th anniversary, and I would hope that there will be some kind of revival. And of course, there are the Bruckner fanatics. We're just rather thin on the ground. But do you think there's something about Bruckner that in some ways is contrary to the spirit of our age, which gets in the way of people giving him the time and attention that he deserves?
It's funny you should mention the anniversary. When I did what we in America call the junior year abroad, so in 1974, which was a Bruckner year, I was in Vienna, and they had all these Bruckner celebrations. And that's where I really got to know Bruckner, hearing all of these wonderful symphonies done by the Vienna Philharmonic that year. I saw Böhm do the 8th. I saw Haitink do the 5th. I saw Karajan do the 7th. It was just a great year. I'm going to sound like an old crotchety old man, but symphony concerts are packaged in a totally different way now. And I don't think that Bruckner can be packaged the way you can package symphonic works of other composers. They're long. They require concentration. Dare I say, in a secular age, they require certain religiosity, whether you believe in God or not.
You wrote about the annexation of Bruckner in your article for his previous anniversary of his death. Now, obviously, for the Nazis, was it a particular sort of psychological connection that Hitler had with the sort of the failure who came to the big city of Vienna and was sort of laughed at? Or was there a sort of why? I mean, because his own politics weren't particularly, he wasn't like Wagner, he wasn't anti-Semite. I mean, what were his politics? Well, I mean, he was very Catholic. I assume he had sort of small c rural Austrian politics, but he was obviously annexed by the Third Reich because of Hitler's kind of personal sort of connection he felt to him. But he didn't have particularly controversial politics like Wagner, for instance. He's not a sort of toxic figure in any way. He seems almost like an innocent.
There was nothing toxic about Anton Bruckner. He had no interest in politics. The only closest connection you could make would be the emperor, the Catholic emperor of Austria. And he felt a loyalty to the crown. Other than that, he had no interest whatsoever in politics. Anti-Semitism was not an issue for him. His connection with Wagner was strictly note-oriented. Bruckner went to Bayreuth to hear Wagner operas, first of all, and also to meet Wagner. And he just really embarrassed himself. He got on his knees and kissed Wagner's hand and said, "Master, I worship you." And then Wagner said, "Don't make such a fuss, Herr Bruckner."
He didn't mean it, though.
I think Wagner loved it. But he was so...
No, dear boy, I'm only semi-divine.
But so he wanted to dedicate one of his symphonies to Wagner, and he had the manuscripts to the second and the third. He showed them to Wagner and said, "Tell me, which one shall I dedicate to you?" And he looked at both of them, and he had a cursory look at the score of the third, where they have this famous trumpet beginning, bum, 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 bum. And he liked that one. He said, "I will let you dedicate the third to me." And Bruckner was just dazzled. And he went back to his hotel, and he was so excited that he forgot which one that Wagner had said that could be dedicated to him. He didn't really forget. He knew it was the third. But he wanted us to make sure, but he was just so nervous. So he wrote a little note to him, "Herr Wagner, is it the one with the trumpet beginning?" And then Wagner writes underneath, "Ja, die Trompete. Ja, yes, the trumpet." And that's a wonderful double autograph where I don't know who, I think it's owned by the Austrian National Library, but it's where Bruckner has the question and Ja, signed by Wagner, a double autograph.
So adding to Ed's point about the strange link to the Third Reich, I think Hitler, yes, had a very keen appreciation of Bruckner, but Bruckner would have been utterly confused and disapproved of the Third Reich, I think. But there's a great story from the UK, I don't know if you know it, about the famous art historian, or he went on to be a famous art historian, Ernst Gombrich, who wrote The Story of Art, one of the most successful books on art history ever. And as a youngish man during the war, the anecdote connected with Bruckner is that during the war, he was a refugee in London, and he was monitoring the broadcasts from Germany. And in May 1945, the broadcasts were interrupted, and they started to play the slow movement of the Seventh, which he knew, of course, and he knew that Bruckner had written it around the time of the death of Wagner, and written, I think, over the top, Der Meister is told, the master's death. And he was the first person to inform Churchill, apparently, of the death of Hitler. And that's how the news broke, through the Bruckner and the Gombrich connection. But that really leads me to want to talk a little bit more about the last symphonies. So the sixth is magnificent, but 7, 8, 9, somehow you're in new territory. And the seventh was his great, the fourth was successful, but the seventh was the really big breakthrough in terms of his reception. And I think there's a sort of spirituality. Some people get nervous with the term, but 7, 8, and 9 seem to take you into completely new territory that no one's been in before or since. Do you want to talk a little bit about the last three?
Thank you. Yes, of course. I mean, the last three, the trio of symphonies at the end, those really are the great ones. Stunning works. And these are works that the seventh made him famous. Now, what's interesting about this is that Bruckner, the Austrian, got salvation in Germany. It was Nikisch who loved the Seventh Symphony and who performed it in Leipzig. And that performance in Leipzig made him famous all over Germany and then ultimately Austria. So and of course, he got an award from the emperor for the Seventh Symphony. And, there's that famous statement. I don't know. We still don't know if it's true or not. But anything I can do for you, Herr Bruckner, the emperor said. Yes, you can tell Hanslick to stop writing bad reviews about my symphonies. I don't know whether or not that's true, but it's a great story. But now we have a fully expanded symphony, an expanded orchestration. He went to Bayreuth and heard the famous Wagner tubas. He starts employing Wagner tubas in these final symphonies. A fully, dare we say, ripe harmonic palette. The slow movement of the seventh is an absolutely remarkable spiritual journey. And it is absolutely true that he heard of the death of Wagner while composing the slow movement of the Seventh Symphony. And that famous climax at the end was, we know it to be true, it was to observe the greatness of the death of the master. One of the few cymbal crashes in any Bruckner symphony. I don't know of any other cymbal crash, but there it is.
Although apparently that's part of this issue of the different versions. And that's something we should talk about a little bit. So I believe the first version of the seventh didn't have the cymbal crash in, and it's still a controversy. I think it's also the eighth is the only one with harps, but the seventh has this famous cymbal crash, which was maybe added later. And one of the difficulties with Bruckner, if you choose to be worried about these things, is that he would write a symphony, it would be performed, and then his students would come up with suggestions. Some of them he accepted, some he didn't, and then he'd revise it. And many of the symphonies have different versions, which I think is a token of his lack of self-confidence in a way. Would you agree?
It's two things. It is partly his lack of self-confidence. It's something else that we should think about. It gets back to something we said earlier in this interview, in that he was an organist, an improviser. And so if you have the mentality of an organist, nothing is ever truly fixed. So we think of when we think of a composer, who finishes the work, and in his mind it's a fixed thing. But in fact, in the mind of the organist Anton Bruckner, nothing was truly ever fixed. And I think it's futile, really, to search for authentic Bruckner. I don't know what authentic Bruckner really is. There is a fabulous musicologist named Ben Korschvedt, and he has written a dissertation. He wrote a dissertation on the versions of the Fourth Symphony. Yeah, I wrote an article about the two versions of the Eighth Symphony. Depending on what you want, you can take either of those two versions. There was a political aspect of this during the Third Reich, and it was, according to the narrative of the Third Reich, is that these meddling Jewish editors and composers got him to change the versions of the symphonies, and we need to go back to the pure sources, the racial purity of Bruckner himself, and so there was that aspect as well.
So the idea was that the editors were Jewish and they had ruined his unedited work, and that was the thing.
That's true. Yeah, there is a racial aspect to it. It's sad the way the politics got kind of polluted the waters, and Bruckner had absolutely nothing to do with it. It had to do with, as I said earlier, the fact that Hitler identified with this fellow Upper Austrian who tried to go to Vienna and as an artist and was rejected by the Viennese status quo, and so was Bruckner. And in fact, Hitler hated Vienna, and he wanted to move the Vienna as a center of music to Linz. He wanted to make Linz the center of music. He said, if I win this war, I'm going to undertake a building campaign to create concert halls and the like in Linz, and that will be the center.
It leads us in a way to talk about his musical influences. So not where he came from, but what came after him. And so often people bracket Bruckner and Mahler together. Obviously, they're different generations. They kind of both wrote 9 symphonies, although you've got the study symphonies with Bruckner, you've got Das Lied von der Erde with Mahler, and the jottings for the 10th, including 1 completed movement. So it's not quite as straightforward, but 9 was always the magic number in 19th century Germanic composers' output. And of course, Beethoven goes without saying, and so possibly Dvorak, depending on how you number them. But can you reflect a little bit on the relationship between Bruckner and Mahler? I know they knew each other. Mahler was a much, much younger man, but on the influence that Bruckner had on Mahler, the differences and similarities, whether we should be thinking of their music in some way as connected and related.
It's well known. I mean, the common narrative, at least when I was in high school, was that Mahler was influenced by Bruckner. He wrote long symphonies. And, the more I studied it, the less of a connection I found. I don't see much of a connection between Bruckner and Mahler. The opening of the 3rd movement of the 9th Symphony with that ascending gesture, and the opening gesture in the last movement of Mahler's 9th,
Bruckner's 9th, yeah.
Bruckner's 9th and Mahler's 9th. That's a similarity. That is a real isolated one, though. Mahler was spiritual, but he was constantly questioning God. His spirituality was one where he was never fully satisfied, never fully complete in his religious thoughts, constantly striving. And Bruckner was entirely satisfied, entirely convinced of God. He dedicated his last symphony to God. Mahler was reading Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, and his music is informed by philosophy and literature, and that's not Bruckner.
So after 40 years of contemplating this and thinking about it, I have come to the conclusion that Bruckner is very Catholic and Mahler is very Jewish, particularly in terms of their religiosity, although, of course, Mahler did convert to Catholicism. And maybe this is a parody of these religious approaches. But Bruckner, it was all about certainty, faith, a God of mountainous proportions. And Mahler, it was about questioning. It was about trying to get to the truth in the sense that the journey there was more important than the destination. And there was not the theological certainty. It was more about questioning than about answers. But perhaps that's far too great a simplification. I'm speaking as a Jew and Ed is a Catholic, so I suppose we're coming to this from different directions. But is that a reasonable approach to thinking about these two men and their music?
I'm speaking as an agnostic. So that's not a simplification. It's what often the simple things are true. For Mahler, it was always the quest, it was the journey. If you look at his symphonies, starting with the first, it's a journey. The last movement, he, to a friend, said, this last movement of my first symphony is a journey from hell to heaven. And every symphony, the second symphony is a journey to heaven. This third symphony is a journey to heaven, but it's a journey. It's the process.
Well, the third is a journey to love, isn't it?
Well, and God is love, according to Mahler. He said, it is what love tells me, but I could have said it is what God tells me. So, and then we go to heaven at the end of the fourth symphony. So it's a journey to heaven and not being in heaven. So I think it applies completely. But one thing I thought we might talk about just to bother the more serious Brucknerians out there, is the last movement of the Ninth Symphony. I need to make a confession out here. I've heard the so-called completion of the Ninth Symphony, and I simply cannot understand it. It doesn't do anything for me.
Oh, I would agree. I mean, I've heard one. I don't know how many they are, but I've heard one, and I kind of couldn't believe it. It was very uninteresting. It was completely un-Brucknerian. So on the one hand, there's the poverty at least one version that I've heard. And then on the other hand, there's the absolute perfection of the end of the third movement of the ninth. It ends as if someone's been through a terrible storm and a huge amount of darkness. And finally, the storm has passed, the light has come out, and the sun is shining in the garden. It just, to me, is the most perfect way to end a symphonic career. I wouldn't want anything to go after it.
And you know that Bruckner wanted to have the Te Deum as the last movement. I heard that one time in Boston with Seiji Ozawa, and it didn't work. I don't know whether or not it's a failure. It sounded like a concert of two pieces. We had the Ninth Symphony, and then we had the Te Deum.
Apparently that was done in the Barbican in London the other week, but I didn't hear it. But I would just have felt it was a performance of the Ninth followed by a performance of the Te Deum.
That's all it is. There's nothing organically connecting those two pieces. Here's how I see this is maybe beyond the interest of the listeners, but when I first heard that reconstructed final movement of the Ninth Symphony, it reminds me of, I used to live up in Maine for 3 years, and to get a car started was very hard. Like, listening to that last move was like cranking up your engine, and it almost starts, and you hear a gesture in Bruckner, and it's repeating. It's almost going to crank up and become something, and it never does. It's like a car that is almost to start, and you think it's going to start, and it doesn't. And it's very frustrating. And I know I'm not supposed to say that as a Brucknerian, but let's have the three movements, please. And as you say, Paul, what a fantastic ending of serenity, of acceptance.
We should probably wrap up by talking a little bit about other influences that Bruckner had. So I don't know whether you think he, in a way, was so sui generis that there was not much influence, or whether his music did influence the later generations. I'm thinking particularly of Richard Strauss, but anyone else you would think, when you listen to them, was influenced by Bruckner, or is the influence of Wagner too great on that generation for you to unpick what might be Brucknerian and what might not be?
I can't think of two more different composers than Strauss and Bruckner. And Strauss really, he was sympathetic. He only conducted 2 symphonies that I know of. He did the 9th and he did the 6th. But he was agnostic, atheist, whatever you want to call Strauss, and unsympathetic with the religious views of Bruckner and religious music in general. I simply don't hear a connection between Bruckner and Strauss. I think the sui generis description is a good one, Paul. I don't think there's anything quite like Bruckner. Maybe, Paul, in film music.
And I think you mentioned Leonard Bernstein. There's a little bit of there's a place for us in number 6, isn't there? If we're allowed to sing on this podcast. In the slow movement.
Yes, but then that's an isolated occurrence. When I think of influence, I think of it on a much grander scale. That's what real influence is, after all.
So to wrap up, perhaps, I wonder if you could address our listeners and tell them, if they've listened to this, they found it quite interesting, but they know nothing about Anton Bruckner and they don't know his music at all, and maybe they don't know much about classical music. Where would you start? And what mindset, what frame of mind would you go into listening with? Can we help our listeners into the wonderful, amazing, magical, exciting, and utterly unique world of Anton Bruckner on this, his 200th anniversary?
I think we all need a healing space to enter. We all need a special space to go to in this very troubling world that we live in. And if you want to do it, I recommend Anton Bruckner. Beginning with the opening tremolo, we will enter a new place, a place you've never been to before. And it's a wonderful place to be. I would suggest to your listeners that you start with the Fourth Symphony, and I would look up the program to it and follow it. The journey via the program is a nice, picturesque journey, but I think if you do that journey, you will find a much deeper one thereafter upon repeated listening, a deeper healing space, a transcendent space, a metaphysical space. And then I would go to the Seventh Symphony. And once you've finished that, go to the magnificent Eighth Symphony. It is tremendous, absolutely tremendous. And then the final journey to God himself, the Ninth Symphony, or whatever God you choose to worship, or nature for that matter. But these are works of great profundity, and it's an alternative world to ours, and a world very much worth visiting. I recommend it highly. As I live through life in America, it's not a pretty place. But Bruckner is a very pretty place for me. And the fact that Bruckner exists is of solace to me. And I hope it could be a solace for some of your listeners. It's worth the journey.